The entire studio fell silent. Simon Cowell stood up from his chair, his hands still gripping the edge of the judge's desk. He wasn't supposed to do this. He never did this. But something about the teenage boy standing on that stage, clutching a worn acoustic guitar like it was the only thing keeping him standing, had stopped everything. The cameras kept rolling, but no one moved. The audience held their breath. And Simon, for the first time in his career, walked away from the judge's table and stepped onto the stage. But to understand why Simon Cowell broke every rule that night, we have to go back to the beginning. To a small town. To a father and son. And to a promise that would change everything. 3 months earlier, in a quiet suburb outside Nashville, a 17-year-old named Ethan Carter sat in his bedroom, staring at his father's guitar. It leaned against the wall, untouched since the funeral. The strings were dusty. The wood still smelled faintly of his dad's cologne. Ethan hadn't been able to pick it up. Not yet. Every time he tried, his hands would shake, and the memories would flood back too fast, too hard. His father, Michael Carter, had been a session musician. Not famous, not wealthy, but deeply loved by everyone who knew him. He'd spent 30 years playing guitar in recording studios, backing up artists whose names people recognized while his own remained in the liner notes. But to Ethan, he wasn't just a musician. He was a hero. A teacher. A best friend. Michael had taught Ethan how to play on that exact guitar. It was a 1978 Martin D28, worn smooth from decades of use. The fretboard had indentations where Michael's fingers had pressed the same chords thousands of times. On the back, carved carefully into the wood, were the initials, MC, and below them, EC, father and son, teacher and student. When Michael was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, everything changed overnight. The doctors gave him 6 months. He made it 4. In those final weeks, when the pain made it impossible to play, Michael would ask Ethan to bring the guitar to his hospital bed. He'd rest his hand on the body of the instrument, and close his eyes, as if he could still feel the vibrations of the music inside. One night, 2 days before he died, Michael squeezed Ethan's hand and whispered, "Promise me something. Take this guitar. Go to that stage you've always talked about. And play. Don't let fear stop you. Don't let grief stop you. Just play." Ethan had promised. But now, staring at the guitar in his empty bedroom, that promise felt impossible. Subscribe and leave a comment, because what happens next will show you why some promises are worth breaking your heart to keep. Ethan's mother found him that night, sitting on the floor with the guitar finally in his lap, tears streaming down his face. She didn't say anything. She just sat beside him. After a long silence, Ethan whispered, "I can't do it, Mom. I can't go on that stage without him." His mother looked at him with the kind of strength only a grieving widow can summon. "Your father didn't ask you to go on that stage with him. He asked you to go for him? There's a difference." 2 weeks later, Ethan submitted an audition tape to America's Got Talent. He didn't tell anyone. He recorded it in one take, in his bedroom, with his father's guitar. He played the song his dad had written for him when he was born, a simple, acoustic melody called Ethan's Song. His voice cracked. His fingers missed notes. But he sent it anyway. When the producers called to say he'd been selected for a live audition, Ethan almost said no. But then he remembered his father's hand on that hospital bed, gripping his, making him promise. Now, standing backstage at the Dolby Theater in Los Angeles, Ethan could barely breathe. The other contestants were warming up, laughing, taking selfies. Ethan just held the guitar and tried not to throw up. A producer with a clipboard came over and asked if he was ready. Ethan nodded, even though he wasn't. As he walked toward the stage entrance, he felt the weight of the guitar strap on his shoulder. It was the same strap his father had used. The leather was cracked and soft from years of use. Ethan closed his eyes and imagined his dad standing beside him, one hand on his shoulder, saying what he always said before a performance. Just breathe, kid. The music knows the way. The stage manager counted down. 3, 2, 1. The curtain opened. And that's when everything changed. The lights hit Ethan like a wall. The audience was a sea of faces, all watching, all waiting. He walked to the center of the stage, his legs trembling, and stood in front of the microphone. The 4 judges sat at their table: Howie Mandel, Heidi Klum, Sofia Vergara, and Simon Cowell. Simon looked up from his notes, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Host Terry Crews stepped forward with his signature smile. Welcome! What's your name, and where are you from? Ethan's voice came out quieter than he intended. I'm Ethan Carter. I'm 17. I'm from Tennessee. And what are you going to do for us today? Terry asked. Ethan glanced down at the guitar in his hands. His throat tightened. I'm going to play a song my dad wrote for me. He passed away 4 months ago. This was his guitar. The audience murmured softly. Howie leaned forward. Heidi's expression softened. Sophia put a hand over her heart. But Simon's face didn't change. He just watched, silent, assessing. Terry placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. I'm so sorry for your loss. Take your time. Ethan nodded. He adjusted the microphone stand, his hands shaking so badly he almost knocked it over. He took a breath. Then another. He positioned his fingers on the fretboard, feeling the familiar grooves his father's hands had made. And then he played. The first chord rang out, clear and pure. The second followed, softer. By the third, Ethan's eyes were closed. He wasn't on a stage anymore. He was back in his dad's music room, sitting across from him, learning this exact song for the first time. He could almost hear his father's voice. Good. Now the chorus. Don't rush it. Let it breathe. Ethan began to sing. His voice was raw, unpolished, but it carried something no technique could teach: truth. You were the morning light, the first sound I knew. You were the hands that held me when the world felt new. And now you're gone, but I still hear your song. In every chord, in every word, you're still here. You're still strong. The audience was completely silent. Heidi's eyes glistened. Howie sat perfectly still. Sophia wiped a tear from her cheek. But Simon's expression hadn't changed. He stared at Ethan with that same unreadable intensity. His arms were still crossed. His jaw was set. And then, something no one expected happened. Ethan reached the bridge of the song. His voice cracked. He missed a chord. His fingers fumbled, and for a moment, it seemed like he might stop entirely. He opened his eyes, and they were filled with tears. He looked down at the guitar, his father's guitar, and his breath hitched. Simon Cowell stood up. The audience gasped. Howie's eyes widened. Heidi sat up straight. Even Terry, standing off to the side, looked shocked. Simon raised one hand and said firmly, "Stop." The music stopped. Ethan looked up, terrified. The entire theater went silent. Every eye was on Simon. He stepped out from behind the judges' table and walked toward the stage. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The cameras followed him. No one knew what was happening. Producers backstage were whispering frantically into their headsets. Simon climbed the steps onto the stage. He walked slowly toward Ethan, his face still unreadable. When he reached him, he stopped just a few feet away. For a long moment, Simon just looked at the boy. Then he looked down at the guitar. He saw the worn wood, the carved initials, the strap that had been repaired with duct tape. And then Simon Cowell did something he had never done in 20 years of judging talent shows. He spoke, not to the cameras, not to the audience, but directly to Ethan. His voice was quiet, but in the silence of that theater, every word was heard. "How old were you when he taught you to play?" Ethan's voice trembled. 5. Simon nodded slowly. "And this is his guitar?" "Yes." Simon reached out and gently touched the body of the guitar, his fingers brushing over the initials carved into the wood. "You know what I see when I look at this?" Ethan shook his head. "I see a father who loved his son enough to give him something that would outlast him. I see a boy who loved his father enough to keep a promise even when it hurt." Simon paused, his voice thick with emotion. "And I see courage." The audience was silent. Tears were streaming down faces all over the theater. Simon stepped back. "I want you to finish the song. Not for me. Not for them." He gestured to the audience. "For him." Ethan's lips trembled. He nodded. Simon walked back to the judge's table. But he didn't sit down. He stood, his arms at his sides, watching. Ethan took a shaky breath. He repositioned his fingers on the guitar. And he played. This time, there were no mistakes. This time, his voice didn't crack. This time, the song poured out of him like a river that had finally been allowed to flow. The melody filled the theater, raw and beautiful and heartbreaking. When he reached the final line, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're still here. You're still strong." The last note hung in the air for a moment. Then, the audience erupted. People were on their feet, clapping, crying, shouting. Howie was wiping his eyes. Heidi had her hands over her mouth. Sophia was openly sobbing. But Simon didn't move. He just stood there, watching Ethan, his expression finally breaking. His eyes were red. His jaw trembled slightly. Terry walked back onto the stage, his own voice shaking. "That was... I don't even have words." The judges gave their feedback. Howie called it one of the most moving performances he'd ever seen. Heidi said Ethan's father would be so proud. Sophia could barely speak through her tears. And then it was Simon's turn. He stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen thousands of performances. I've heard every story. But what you just did, that wasn't a performance. That was a son honoring his father. That was love made audible." He paused, looking directly into Ethan's eyes. "Your father gave you that guitar. But you gave him something even greater. You gave him immortality. Because as long as you play, he's still here." The audience roared. And then Simon Cowell did one more thing no one expected. He walked over to the judge's table, placed his hand on the golden buzzer, and slammed it down. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling. The audience screamed. Ethan stood frozen, his mouth open, tears pouring down his face. Simon walked back onto the stage and pulled the boy into a hug. Ethan collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Simon held him, his own eyes closed, and whispered something the cameras didn't catch. But later Ethan would tell reporters what he said. "He's proud of you. And so am I." Share this video and subscribe, because this is the kind of story the world needs to remember. This is what courage looks like. This is what love sounds like. Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Simon found Ethan sitting alone in a hallway, still holding the guitar. Simon sat down beside him, not saying anything at first. Finally Ethan spoke. "Thank you? For stopping me. For everything." Simon nodded. "You didn't need me to stop you. You just needed a reminder that you weren't alone up there." Ethan looked down at the guitar. "I almost didn't come. I almost broke my promise." Simon turned to him. "But you didn't. And that's the only thing that matters." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Simon stood, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and said, "Keep playing. The world needs to hear what your father taught you." Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling and the confetti had been swept away, Simon found Ethan sitting alone in a corner, the guitar resting across his lap. The boy was staring at nothing, his face still wet with tears, his hands trembling slightly as they touched the worn strings. Simon sat down beside him without saying a word. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of crew members breaking down equipment, and the muffled cheers of the audience still filing out of the theater. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper. I almost didn't come tonight. I almost broke my promise. Simon looked at him, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen it on television. But you didn't. Ethan's fingers traced the carved initials on the back of the guitar. Every time I picked this up, I felt like I was failing him. Like I could never play it the way he did. Like I wasn't good enough to carry it. Simon shook his head slowly. Your father didn't give you that guitar because he wanted you to play like him. He gave it to you so you could play like you. That's the whole point. Ethan looked up, his eyes red and questioning. You think he wanted a copy? Simon continued. He already was himself. What he wanted was for you to find your own voice. And tonight you did. That song wasn't perfect. Your voice cracked. You missed notes. But it was real. And real is worth more than perfect. A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. I wish he could have seen it. Simon's voice was firm but kind. He did. Every father lives in what he gives his children. That guitar, those lessons, that song, he's in all of it. And every time you play, he's there. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Simon stood up, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Keep playing. Not because you promised him, but because the world needs to hear what he taught you. Ethan would go on to win America's Got Talent that season. But the real victory happened that night, when a grieving boy kept a promise to his father, and a hardened judge remembered what it meant to be human. And it all started with a father's guitar, a son's promise, and a judge who knew when to stop the show and just listen.